We are now recording. Welcome again. It is Tuesday, February 25th, 2020. And I'm going to begin screen sharing immediately. And I'm going to rely on Alex to kind of coach me through. Do you see the full screen?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so here we go. So today we're going to be talking about the Net Promoter Score and overall experience rating, two of the big questions that the COVES survey kind of routinely monitors for each site and then comparatively across sites. Here is the agenda for the day. I'm going to be talking for the first maybe 15 minutes, maybe not, maybe more, on some of the theoretical background, provide an overview of each question, and then dig into the quantitative data a little bit from the big data perspective, if you will, of our many sites. Then I'm going to turn it over to Alex for about 10 minutes to talk about some of the qualitative data and the coding that we've started to do, but that's really what preempted this webinar, to start a discussion with all of you around how we're making sense of the data beyond what the numbers tell us. And that's when we'd like to turn it over to questions. There will be an opportunity for questions about midway through in case there are any points of clarification that are necessary or anything like that. But for the most part, if you could hold your questions until that Q&A period, that would be really helpful for us just to get through some of the material that we've prepared. And then the last 15 minutes or more, if we've got time, we'd love to open it up to a full group conversation around how people are making sense of NPS, OER, how they've started analyzing it, maybe in more sophisticated ways than the dashboard allows, and any other questions or prompts for discussion around NPS and OER. For now, though, you can feel free to record some notes for us, either personally or for the full group in the chat section of the Zoom room. All right, and we're going to continue. Okay, so why does COVES use the Net Promoter Score and overall experience questions? We have been trying to think about customer experience metrics that are standardized across survey administrations. And that's a fancy way of saying that, you know, when there's individual variation from survey to survey, it doesn't really help anybody make sense of the data in a more intuitive way. So having two standardized metrics that the field writ large has produced is really useful for us in thinking about this. Furthermore, by using NPS and OER, we are explicitly avoiding the words expectation and satisfaction. And I have some bullet points here about why that's important, because visitors often come with multiple expectations. It's hard to quantify, was your expectation met or not, because there are many, or could be many, expectations that visitors have when they come to any of our museum sites. Furthermore, you could be simultaneously satisfied and dissatisfied with different aspects of the visit, so it's insufficient for us to ask a satisfaction question that captures everything. So NPS and OER come into the picture in direct response to that last bullet point in an attempt to holistically capture sentiments in a meaningful way without asking 27 questions about the experience, right? In a way that's kind of shortened or simplified. So starting with the Net Promoter Score, since it's a little bit older, the first publication that I reference when talking about NPS is that December 2003 article, The One Number You Need to Grow, that was published in the Harvard Business Review by Frederick Reichheld. The link on the slide is the entire article, so you can go and read about it. There was a book that preceded this article called The Loyalty Effect, and that was really the genesis of this idea of the Net Promoter Score, loyalty. So the book in 2001 that came before it was what generated this whole Net Promoter Score revolution. It was in co-development with Bain & Company and the Satmetric Systems, both of which I've bolded because they kind of co-own the measure anytime you reference it in the literature. But more importantly, that fourth bullet point, the follow-up books that came after the Harvard Business Review article, The Ultimate Question and then The Ultimate Question 2.0, which was released in 2011 with Rob Markey, have been really instrumental in kind of furthering this ability of the Net Promoter Score to think about holistic measures for any business in any industry as far as customer perceptions. In case you don't want to purchase the book or are disinterested but still want to figure out what it's about, there is a speed summary, which I found kind of interesting, and the link is provided right there as well. And for all of these slides, again, we'll release the webinar, but I can also share these links so that everyone has access to them. I'm assuming you can't click on the links live, while I'm doing this recording. The Net Promoter Score, as most of you are familiar with, but just to make sure we all understand, asks the question, on a scale from 0 to 10, how likely are you to recommend, insert business name, the Museum of Science, to a friend or colleague? Thinking about the words not at all likely as an anchor over 0 and extremely likely as an anchor over 10, the scale is broken up into 3 different segments of respondents. 0 to 6 are the detractors, 7 and 8 are the passives, 9s and 10s are the promoters. And the way the net score is calculated is by taking the percentage of respondents who are 9s and 10s, those promoters, and subtracting from that the percentage of detractors, 0s to 6s. You will note that it is possible to have a score of negative 100 if all of your respondents are detractors, or a score of positive 100 if all of your respondents are promoters. And most of the time, it falls somewhere in between those two tail ends, negative 100 and positive 100. So you have a range of 200 scale points. This is important to recognize because when we do comparisons to other industries, not museums, the benchmarks really wildly vary. The example I use in training a lot is that the industry of telecommunications, like your internet service provider or your cable company, they typically, Xfinity, Comcast, all of those companies, the industry benchmark is close to 0. And as a museum field, as we've started demonstrating with several years of aggregate COVES data, our industry benchmark is really 71, right in that 71 range. So that's a big difference, and it's worth noting. But it's also worth noting that in this calculation of the net score, the passives are omitted. They're not included in the net calculation. And so there's a certain percentage of people who kind of don't factor into that net, even though they're in the negative space. The reason that the Net Promoter Score came to be widely accepted by many different businesses, and in fact, depending on which year or book or article you read, they claim that something like 2/3 of Fortune 1000 companies use the Net Promoter Score to monitor their business. The objective is to predict customer loyalty. Again, thinking about the loyalty effect as the precursor to that one number you need to grow article that Reichheld wrote. Thinking about loyalty in terms of repurchase, revisit, referral. How am I going to keep my business? How is this going to sustain my bottom line? And furthermore, that differences in net promoter scores could be used to explain substantial differences in revenue. So this was like a big money profit designed metric. But jumping all the way down to the third bullet point, the metric that's customer facing rather than operational. So rather than just looking at revenues and saying this is how good we're doing, using that as a corollary to revenue growth for any industry, the goal here was to predict loyalty and sustainability in the long run. But in that second bullet point, you can see here that even though the article was called the one number you need to grow, it wasn't just one question. There was the net promoter score question, how likely are you to recommend? But then there was a follow-up that asked why. So what is the reasoning behind the rating? And you understand, for those of you that are very familiar with your COVES instrument, you know that we ask that follow-up, what's the most important reason for the rating you provided, to get at a better sense of why those numbers were provided by the visitor. So by soliciting open-ended feedback, it was thought that companies could identify reference customers and improvement opportunities, which they call closing the loop. Because the Net Promoter Score is not quite 20 years old, but closing in on a decade and a half to 2 decades of industry-wide use, there have been a lot of critical articles that have come out against the use of Net Promoter Score, or at least refuting some of those initial claims, which it's really good to at least have out in the open because we use Net Promoter Score as part of COVES. And some of those big criticisms are that making use of that why in response to the Net Promoter Score is hard to do. It takes a lot of staff time to unpack the qualitative data, to put it into a meaningful framework, and to follow up with the customer. And furthermore, that it's impossible to do in real time. So if you're trying to correct any business practices with the visitor still in the museum or with the customer still in the store or whatever, it's very difficult to do that because you need to have the responses, analyze them, and then circle around. Again, closing the loop. So closing the loop takes time, and it can be hard to do. There have been several research articles that have come out in that time as well that question the predictive validity of this whole repurchase referral aspect, and that are responses to questions that ask about things like intentionality, how likely are you to do this thing, are not always quite as aligned with actual behavior as we'd like. So there have been some articles that refute that claim. And furthermore, that simplifying a lot of data to a single number, which is incredibly useful for reporting, contradicts this notion of being able to use the qualitative follow-up to understand why the rating was given. And for an explanation of some of these criticisms and more, I provided another link that was published in the Harvard Business Review as recently as late last year that you can read up on if that's of interest to you. Diving into the overall experience rating now, the overall experience rating, OER, was developed at the Smithsonian Institution in the mid-2000s. I wasn't able to find like the article that released this or talked about its development in any of the Smithsonian archives, but it was published by Andrew Peckerick, and there's a great article from 2 years ago that gets into both the development of the scale as well as some of its current uses in museums, which I have cited here for you. It's freely available on ResearchGate. The overall experience rating question looks like this. Please rate your overall experience for this visit to institution name. Now, I will note that this version is the way that COVES asks the overall experience rating question, but that in some of its most early occurrences in the literature, it was used to talk about overall experience for specific exhibits or programs. So instead of saying for this visit, you could ask, please rate your overall experience to this exhibit, and think about just that. The scale, though, hasn't changed at all. So from a measurement perspective, we are doing exactly as the overall experience methodology was developed. And it's a 5-point scale. As you can see, there are no numbers. It's just the words poor, fair, good, excellent, and superior. Typically, when analyzing overall experience ratings, poor, fair, and good are combined into what's called less than excellent ratings. This is done for a couple of reasons. One, from a statistical standpoint, excellent, the word excellent and the ratings to excellent are the most stable, regardless of the atmosphere in which OER is used. That is, you can have a lot of variability in the less than excellent ratings and a lot of variability in the superior ratings, but the excellent kind of anchors the scale. Because of this, the authors recommend that you either from left to right do poor, fair, good, excellent, superior, or if you're doing a vertical scale, poor is at the top, poor, fair, good, excellent, superior. That visitors or respondents to this question make meaning of the superior response option as a beyond excellent rating. And that's very important. The claims of OER are a little bit different than the Net Promoter Score. So it's worth noting first and foremost that OER was developed in museum settings. So this is a museum experience type rating that is very beneficial for COVES to use. Specifically, the authors reference that OER is responsive to 4 key dimensions of the quality of experience, which is obviously what we're trying to measure. That the measure is subjective, user-centric, holistic, and multidimensional. As I just mentioned, it purposefully uses a non-numerical scale. So poor, fair, good, excellent, superior don't have the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 above them, but that it's ordered from least good to most good. And we're going to look at some pictures in just a second to kind of dig into that a little bit. And the purpose of changing this scale to have a superior endpoint is that it extends beyond excellent, as my bullet point shows, thus changing the distribution of responses. Furthermore, the authors, most recently of that 2018 article, argue that unlike the Net Promoter Score, OER can be used in predictive analytics. That is, you could use different types of analyses to try and predict overall experience ratings based on other known factors in the museum. And they argue that this is unlike the Net Promoter Score because the Net Promoter Score scale, the 0 to 10 scale, has some flaws that restrict some of the analysis that can be done with it. On the 2018 YouGov website, there was this really interesting look at different words that could be used to anchor positive and negative scales. So you can see here that the question was posed to, I think, like 5,000, 3,000 or 5,000 individuals on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is very negative and 10 is very positive. In general, how positive or negative would the following word or phrase be to someone when you use to describe something? And hopefully you can see my mouse and my screen share, but down here, although superior is not in this list, outstanding was a word that was piloted in the scale along with superior, and they were found to be almost interchangeable in terms of the statistics. And so you can see that there's a big shift from negative to positive, but that superior really does do a good job of getting at one of the most extreme or goodest, if you will, responses that someone could provide to a question like this. It's also important to note that even though outstanding is not at the top of the list, or superior if we use them interchangeably, perfect is. The authors argue that it's important to note that superior is not perfect. It is very rare for anything to be perfect. I think most of us would agree that that's not what we're trying to capture here. The next slide shows this same survey and actually shows it some differences between United States and UK respondents. And this is important because, as at least one of our sites has started discovering, we may have differences in our ratings when thinking about where our visitors come from. So using those same words of very negative to very positive responses, outstanding is still at the top, and US respondents tend to pull a little bit down on the overall mean. I don't want to focus on this too much, but you can click on the link, or I'll send that link out after the webinar if you're interested in reading more about this analysis. Thinking about the origins of both of those, I'd like to just share these two links as the current efforts of both methodologies, the Net Promoter Score and the overall experience rating. There's been a shift in the Net Promoter world to think about the loyalty economy in ways that we better understand our business practices through using the Net Promoter Score system. And there was a really nice write-up in last month's Harvard Business Review on how this shift is occurring. And for the overall experience rating proponents, they've created a Google group that is museum user specific that you can sign up for if you're interested in contributing by way of your own OER data, as well as just hearing some of the comments and questions that have come up for using OER in museum experiences. That has been really helpful. I know some of you on the webinar today are already in this group, and if you're really interested in how it's being used, I recommend that you join, because just like the community of practice that COVES is developing, we get strength in numbers here. So I'm going to pause here for questions. I'm going to stop screen sharing and see if there were any things that have come up just based on those first 20 slides or so. And if not, we obviously have a lot more to discuss here and then get you talking about.
Hey, Ryan, this is Megan. Can you hear me okay?
I can, Megan. Hi.
Okay, hi. This microphone's not the best. I might have missed this. I was a few minutes late, but why did you guys choose to include the Net Promoter Scale? It doesn't seem to offer as much. And, you know, as we consider the length of the survey, can you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, I can. So when we actually first started this, overall experience rating wasn't being as widely used as it is today, even in museum studies. So the truth of the matter is, when we did our instrument crosswalk that helped us create that first core COVES instrument, we hadn't seen OER yet. Net Promoter Score was being used by a number of different institutions because the museum leaders were interested in kind of comparing their own data to other industries. And if you remember, when COVES was first created, that was the only benchmark we had, because COVES wasn't really a thing yet. We weren't comparing to other museums yet. We were comparing to everyone else. And NPS is still really, you know, I should have prefaced this whole thing by saying NPS and OER tend to have some followers, some believers, right? They're both theoretical approaches to understanding the visit experience. Neither Alex nor I fall in either camp, right? We're neutral, we're agnostic, supporters of both. And so in my many conversations around, you know, how can these two ratings be used, or why are they included on the survey? The short answer is because a lot of people know what Net Promoter Score is, and OER is still developing that systematic following across museums. So right now, I would also say that when you think about the questions themselves, they ask different things, right? What was your overall experience at the museum today? And how likely are you to recommend this thing to a friend or colleague? So when I simplify it at its most core, Net Promoter Score is really how likely are you to create word of mouth advertising for my institution above and beyond that passive zone? An overall experience rating is trying to get at how awesome, how excellent or superior or less than excellent was everything about the museum visit today.
Thank you. That was helpful.
Ryan, can I say something about that too? Just that Net Promoter Score also, I think part of why I like having both is that Net Promoter Score does kind of take into account a little bit of who is in your community. Like it could be that you had a fantastic, and this is what I like about comparing the two, because it could be that you personally had a fantastic experience, but there's nobody like you in your world who would also appreciate this experience. Like maybe you're a parent, a young parent with kids, and none of your friends have kids or something like that. And so for me, I like being able to, I mean, I think there are a lot of issues with Net Promoter Score and there's a lot of critique, but I like being able to compare the two of them.
Yeah, I should have also led this entire webinar by saying, Alex and I know a lot, but we're certainly not experts. There are a lot of people in this group who may know a lot about this, and there are certainly people outside of this group who know even more. And most of the developers of the scales are pretty accessible, so if we need to dig in deeper, that is definitely a possibility.
Hey, Ryan. I have a quick question about OER.
Yeah.
And I know that you mentioned that the way to ask about that is to insert institution name. But what about when we're asking OER for a specific event or program that's happening at the museum on that day? So it's just kind of made me think about whether respondents may be thinking, beyond what that event was. Is it okay to describe or use the name of the event as opposed to the institution? And does it matter? What are your thoughts around that?
No, as I mentioned, it actually was developed to think about the overall experience within an exhibition, within a program like you just described. And so I think if you look at the article that I will send the link out to, that 2018 OER development article, the phrasing was, please rate your overall experience, and then they used brackets that said, to this exhibit, right, to this program. So it's perfectly acceptable to change the phrasing of this question to specifically address what you're trying to get them to think about holistically. Now, using the word holistic is important because, as we all know, an exhibition can have many components. Some of those could be broken, some of those could be awesome. Maybe there was an interactive demonstration that was part of it. But the overall experience to that exhibition or that program or something makes the visitor think about all pieces together, which is that multidimensional aspect of the quality of experience that I mentioned at the beginning.
Okay.
And I should note that there are some COVES sites that use the overall experience rating as we do on the core instrument to get at the whole visit, and still ask about the overall experience to the temporary exhibition or the specific program. And as you all know from customizing your own surveys, we don't encourage you to just do that for everything. That gets really confusing really quickly. But if you've got the overall experience for the museum and then the overall experience to that focal area, focal exhibition, we do have institutions who do that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to keep going in the interest of time. If I can figure out the technology again. I am sharing. Okay, cool. So we're past the questions. So this is my segue to Alex's section, but as many of you have seen in the aggregate report, and if you haven't, you should, right? It's available online. We've got print copies still available, all that kind of good stuff. Here is the aggregate data from last fiscal year, June 30th, 2018, sorry, July 1st, 2018 to June 30th, 2019. The overall net promoter score for all sites combined was 71.5. The overall experience rating you can see is broken up into percent superior, which is roughly a third of our visitors, percent excellent, just over half, and then you see the percentage good here. The reason good is presented is because we have collectively so few poor and fair respondents that it's less than 2% of the overall. So we've kind of condensed that. I think next year maybe we'll relabel it LTE, less than excellent, but really that's what we're showing here. And furthermore, in that same report, we showed that even though we've got stability in our median net promoter score at the aggregate level, institutionally, there's a lot of variation. And so that's kind of where this conversation is coming from, right? The genesis of understanding this, trying to get conversation around how to make sense of the data, where we go from here. We did not do this type of comparison for overall experience rating for a couple of reasons. One, we only added the OER question to the COVES core survey midway through FY18, so we don't have a ton of data that would populate the left side of any chart that we produced. And second of all, we didn't have a solid understanding if we'd compare percent excellent, percent superior, percent less than excellent as a means of tracking year-to-year change over time for each institution. It's something we're continuing to explore, but we don't have that yet. But the point of this graph is to show that at the aggregate level, we have basically a flat line at the median, and underneath all of that, there's a lot of change. So when Alex and I, or when the whole Leadership Advisory Committee thinks about how to better understand the data or what to report on, one of the things that we thought about was just comparing NPS and OER. As Josh mentioned, maybe part of the Net Promoter system doesn't apply because the friend or colleague that you'd refer to are very dissimilar from yourself, or maybe they're very similar to yourself. Whereas the overall experience rating gets you to think about just what you saw or did or experienced during the museum visit. If these two ratings were to align perfectly and be redundant, I would expect a distribution like this, where at the polar ends, poor and detractor, we saw a lot of alignment. In the middle categories, passive and good, there'd be a lot of alignment. And in superior and promoter, there would be a lot of alignment. And then a scattering throughout. But I wouldn't expect to see superiors who were detractors or people who were promoters and rated OER question poor. But I know our data a little bit better than that, so I would argue that maybe we see this skewed data where there's a cluster of people in the good, excellent, passive category or the excellent, superior, promoter category. And so I was hypothesizing what this distribution would look like if I were to actually compare our data. And using the FY19 COVES aggregate, here are a whole bunch of numbers, which are a lot to take in. But if you look at the color coding system, you can see that there's one category in particular that shows a lot of alignment, and that is visitors who say they had an excellent and were promoters. That there's also consistency in superiors and promoters, 32.4% of everyone, of over 14,000 responses. And that there was also strong alignment in passives who said they had an excellent experience, 11.7 responses. But what's really interesting is that we see some responses that show discord, right? Superiors who had a passive or detractor, or promoters who were good, fair. Thankfully, there were no promoters who had a poor time, because that would just blow my mind too much to really dig into. But we see some data that kind of made us scratch our heads. And so this is where I'm going to turn the presentation over to Alex to start digging into these data a little bit deeper.
Thanks, Ryan. So what I did is I started looking at the follow-up question that we added for each, the Net Promoter Score and the overall experience rating questions. And if you remember, they alternate. So no visitor ever is going to answer both an open-ended follow-up to their NPS score and to their OER score. So we can't compare those in that exact way. But looking at those places where you see that discord, as Ryan was pointing out, you can see some kind of interesting things, even though it's very few visitors, but it kind of underlines the differences in those questions. So the blue text that's on this slide is the people who are answering the follow-up to Net Promoter Score. So why would they or wouldn't they recommend the museum? And the green is people answering the overall experience rating question. So this is people who were NPS detractors, just some examples, and who but rated their OER as excellent or superior. So they had a good experience, but they wouldn't necessarily recommend the museum to a friend or colleague. So you see in a couple of instances, someone saying it's good, but that thing doesn't come up in conversation. So that's a kind of a realistic response, like when in conversation am I going to be recommending a museum or something? I don't know. Exhibits don't change often enough, which is kind of interesting to me. Maybe visiting one time is good, but they wouldn't recommend someone to visit, more than once because the exhibits don't change. Kind of to Josh's point, someone pointing out that I would recommend this experience, but all my friends and family are in, another location. So that was the location. There was a state that the museum was, not in. So it's like, oh, my friends and family are across the country from where this museum is. So why would I recommend it to them? They're not going to come necessarily. And then there's a couple of comments for the overall experience rating that I think are interesting. Kind of thinking about whose experience they're talking about. The first one up there, our child's experience. Clearly, these parents or family members, whoever they were, didn't necessarily have the best time themselves, but it sounds like their child had a really good experience. So they might not recommend the museum as a place to visit, but their child had a great experience. And then someone else who was sort of saying, I had a good time, but I wish that it was a little bit better. And maybe this is an adult who has a community of adults, and they wouldn't necessarily recommend the museum to their adult friends. So then on the flip side, we have people who would recommend the museum, but who had a bad experience. That poor, fair, below good. This is just I didn't even do less than excellent. I did like the very, very low end of the scale here. So one person answering to NPS why they were a promoter, they didn't really have a good experience, but they said it's the only science museum of its kind in this area. So if you are recommending a science museum, this is the one. And then I found interesting, a couple of like visit specific characteristics. So like, yes, I would recommend the museum, but I did not have a good experience today, which is a good kind of reminder about how the COVES survey really is about that visit that day. And it's interesting to see people thinking about it. There was a really weird circumstance. The fire alarm went off. We came back in and the exhibit we were going to wasn't working, but we're going to come back. Construction noise, that's a temporary thing, but it really impacted our visit. So those are some interesting things that I found kind of digging into that data. Continuing for a little bit more closely digging into that open-ended data, I wanted to share a little bit of one thing we've been trying at the Museum of Science for that open-ended follow-up coding. We had a couple of research assistants here take all the available data we had. This was a few months ago. So from November 1st, 2018, when we added these open-ended follow-ups through the summer of 2019, we gave them that data and we wanted them to start coding it. And we gave them a starting point of, we had a previous comment card report that we had worked on. We had looked at all of the comment cards that had come in for years and years, right as we were switching from, a primarily comment card based system to our pre-COVES visitor data collection system of VXM, the Visitor Experience Monitoring Project, to kind of catalog the differences between what we were seeing in the comment cards and what we were going to see, with our more, the systematic random sampling of our old Visitor Experience Monitoring Project. So, we have, roughly 700-ish responses overall for the follow-ups for each of them. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the coding scheme they used and what we saw. This may or may not be something that is directly useful for your institution. Maybe it'll give you some ideas. I've already got other ideas about what we should do with this, and maybe something we could have done differently, but I'll start sharing. So first, what we had them look at was just kind of a sentiment analysis. Was the comment positive? Was it mixed, neutral, negative? And so comparing that for the Net Promoter Score. So for that time period that we were just talking about, November 2018 through summer 2019, the NPS was distributed with 72% promoters, 24% passives, and 4% detractors. And you can see that when you look at just kind of the sentiment coding that our research assistants did, positive, vast majority are positive, which, generally would probably mean that a lot of those passives were giving positive comments, but not rating at the, top end of the scale for some reason. And then so for the overall experience rating, you see kind of the superior and excellent categories there. Roughly within, there's, if you add those up, it's 86% or something, 80% positive rating. So that's like, it's a close match. And then the, interestingly, the negative comments that they saw seem to maybe have been distributed more into good even. I'm not really sure what could have been happening there, but probably some people who left mixed comments still rated superior or excellent. And then even beyond the sort of the sentiment, we looked at this coding scheme from the comment card report that we had worked on some years ago. So these were I think it's like 15 or so categories that our old comment cards came in around. One thing that Ryan and I were just talking about was that it would be really interesting moving forward to, instead of starting with a pre-existing coding scheme, to just look more directly at what codes were emerging for these NPS and OER follow-ups, because this is a comment card scheme. Our follow-up questions are asked on a random sampling basis. And we all know, we all talk about at the training whenever, you probably remember from when we were at your site, that comment cards have that bimodal distribution where people are either, super negative or super positive, whereas there's a much more distributed kind of mushy middle from our random sampling category. So I wonder what kinds of different categories would come up. But mapping onto this scheme, on the left, the chart on the left is the NPS ratings, and the chart on the right is the OER ratings. Museum is a very general rating, which we'll dig more into in the next two slides. But you'll see, the overall distribution is pretty similar. Like there's kind of the top few, and then there's a whole lot of lower incidence things below. General exhibits factors more in the NPS rating than it does in the OER rating. But obviously still the highest category is the overall museum. So what does that look like? What is contained within that museum category? There's two slides kind of showing this. So these are the kinds of things people were saying for the most important reason for your follow-up, or for your rating, sorry, for NPS or OER. And NPS is in blue and the OER is in that yellow-orange color. And so still also a lot of similarity. A couple interesting differences are for NPS, it's a little bit more likely that child appropriate family friendly is a reason for their rating. OER, or same for this big / lots to do variety. Maybe having a lot to do is more of an influence for someone recommending it to a friend or colleague because of the diversity of our friends and colleagues and family members, versus you can only do so much in a single visit for OER. And so and then we have kind of even lower incidence things. So these look really different, but we're looking at n = 7, n = 6, just a few responses in these categories for what influenced people's Net Promoter Score and OER. So this is what we've sort of started doing at the Museum of Science. We have thoughts about where we might go with this next, and we haven't even really, we could go back and more directly compare it to the comment cards that we used to receive to kind of close that loop from comment cards to VXM to COVES, and to see what this looks like. But actually, I'll leave it there. We have some, time for questions, or even just discussion of what you all are doing at your own institutions using either NPS or OER or both, similarities, differences, anything.
Alex, I have a question. I was really interested in your, I guess it was the sentiment analysis of the OER. I don't know if we can go back to that image, to that graph, but you were sort of saying, I wonder what's going on there with the goods. Like, is the, or a lot of, go back. Yeah, that one. We have all these negative comments but we don't have a lot of negative OER rating, like very low OER ratings. And I'm wondering, do you have the data such that you can actually see this comment was given that rating? Like, don't you have that connection? And could you actually take those bars in the OER part of this and sort of fill them up with sentiment? So you could kind of see, which you sort of did with the green, the blue, and the yellow, but you could actually like say this was a negative sentiment and it sits in the excellent category, and this was a negative sentiment and it sits in the good category, and so forth.
Yeah, we could definitely do that. And it was just kind of the way that the file was set up from the people who coded it, is that the OER actually was there. I didn't get time to kind of do that mapping that you referenced.
Yeah.
I would also like to do that for Net Promoter Score. So that's kind of another thing that kind of a next step that I think we would do. Although like, it's pretty easy to guess what's happening with the Net Promoter Score one, right? Like you're like, okay,
Right.
passive. It's all, there's just fewer categories for things to fall into. But
Right.
I
I mean,
think,
you give it an 8 and then you give a positive comment.
of course, like
It's kind
that's
of,
not
and then
surprising.
you're a passive, but you're positive. Yeah.
Or if you're,
But it'd still be
Canadian, you give it a 5 and then you give it a really positive comment, right? Isn't that?
right. Yeah. But I think that would be cool. Also, another question: is this kind of analysis something that COVES is considering offering for COVES institutions, or like, is this something that the Museum of Science did for itself, or is this something COVES did for the Museum of Science? Like,
This is something we kind of assigned as a COVES, MOS specific COVES task for some of our kind of to pull in more of our research assistants into getting familiar with the like COVES data or doing stuff that, you know, we haven't been able to do with the big set of COVES data. I certainly don't think that the coding categories that we have, there's no reason to think that those would be appropriate for the aggregate data. I think, like, I mean, they were developed from comment cards at the museum. I'm not sure if they'd be quite right. So at this time, that kind of coding isn't something we're thinking of like doing for the aggregate data, but in terms of supporting other institutions who have interest in looking into it, or even if we learn more about, you know, this type of coding, perhaps there is a very simple sort of coding scheme we could eventually push to the aggregate data, even if it's like sentiment analysis or something like that. That can get really
right.
tricky
Yeah, I was
to do, but that would be.
Yeah, I was thinking about the sentiment analysis, and just even if there's some training that can be written up, not given as a
Oh,
from
sure.
human to human, but some kind of write up that other COVES institutions could try themselves. That would be interesting, and it'd be cool to see if, especially since that Net Promoter Score diagram was so showed so much variation from within a museum from over time. Might we learn something by doing sentiment analysis, at one year and then to the next, especially for a museum that's seen a big change, it might be worth investing in
That's
that
actually a
kind
really good
of
idea.
coding.
So I'll jump in to just sort of build on Josh's question, because one of the things I tried this year with our NPS and OER data from 2019, and for us, we're looking at the calendar year, is I put together a new report where I actually presented the basic quantitative stuff, looked at some patterns between subsets of our audience, and saw, like, for example, people who know us better, our members, our repeat visitors, our locals tend to give us higher ratings, particularly on NPS. But then I also took all those comments, and I didn't do the coding that MOS has done, although we've got a similar comment card system that has its own set of codes. But I just presented all the comments by the rating that people provided for either NPS or OER, and then did some just manual sorting on it, so you could sort of start to see the patterns. And what I saw in ours is pretty similar to what MOS was just showing. And so, like, on the OER, where we started to see more of the negative comments were really with the good ratings. There were a few in the excellent, maybe about crowding or something like that, but the good section was the more varied in tone. So some of them were positive, but that was also where you saw the impacts of crowding or some exhibits not working or things like that coming up. The one thing I will also note when I look at the open-ended feedback related to NPS and OER compared to our comment cards, which we are continuing to do as a separate system, and it's a part of the nature of a comment card, typically the comment cards have richer comments overall. There are still some basic ones, of course, but when I look at the NPS and the OER comments, those, more of them are the basic, it's fun, it's educational, kids enjoyed it, and less of the more specific things that we continue to see on our comment cards. So it's just, for us, I think it's still helpful to have both. We'll see if that continues in the future as we start getting more familiar with what we see on NPS and OER. But yeah, we've been starting to look more at the comments as well.
I would say we definitely see some of this. I didn't even really address that, the that you're talking about, but there's a ton of, yeah, interactive, fun, good for kids, fun, good, interesting. Like that absolutely is the case as well. Do you have a question, Megan? Okay, you unmuted.
Oh,
You're getting ready to ask.
I have another question, if it's okay, but I'm happy to let other people ask if they have questions. So maybe I'll just wait a second, see if anybody wants to jump in.
I have a
Okay,
question, but you can go ahead. I'll
no,
go after
Julie,
you.
please. No, please, I'll go after you if there's opening.
Oh, we're so nice. I was wondering if anyone has experience asking NPS through a different format and how that might have differed from the format of an on-site intercept on a digital platform. So for the example, I have asked NPS in an email survey that when the emails were collected on site through a random sample. So it's not a total like weird email survey. It's still a random sample on site, but then it's still email and kind of flawed in a different way. So any thoughts on how that's going to look different from in a COVES intercept on a digital platform?
Well, I've got some thoughts about that. I mean, obviously, you know that the COVES pilot study investigated multiple methods of collecting data. And obviously, you know that we used to do it in that same format at the Museum of Science years ago. And
yeah,
so,
I wonder why I chose that like 4 years ago to try.
That is bizarre. It's almost like you worked here.
It didn't work very well, and I quit it after a year.
So, as you know from the pilot study, I think, and I would love to hear from other people who have thoughts on this as well, but what we saw from our email survey was that even if people agreed to provide an email address on the floor, the visitors who were most likely to respond to that emailed survey were we had a higher distribution of members. I was going to say visitors, members, and members are more likely to rate Net Promoter Score and overall experience higher, and provide substantive feedback that reflects that positive rating. So that's one way in which it's skewed towards the positive. And through our pilot study, we also learned that there are different artifacts in the data, depending on the method the data are collected by, such that an interview method, which is not the method that you just mentioned, but interview, you've got that people were more likely to give perfect tens to the Net Promoter Score rating when they were asked by a data collector in person, as opposed to either the email or the on-site survey method. So those are the two data points I have.
And to make more explicit a little bit of what Ryan was saying, like when we compared the old Net Promoter Score collected with emails to the COVES Net Promoter Score, it went down, right? So our Net Promoter Score went down from the switch to our old survey system to the new one. And so it required some, not actually too much, but some, preparation with, the senior team here to say methodology matters. This is what's happening.
So I'll ask my question on that Net Promoter Score graph that showed lots of variation for some museums over time. I was just wondering if you had any ideas about what might be going on there, and particularly any methodological issues, like did that correlate with like the size of the samples from that museum? Yeah, so like are the ones that are showing big change also the ones that like have relatively small sample sizes because they're small museums and they don't have a lot of visitors or something? Just I'm wondering about specious variation.
So we didn't investigate. It's hard to put a finger on that, and actually that kind of gets at what Justin has just chimed in the chat box. What do you do when you see change over time that's more than a little bit, right? And you can quantify that however you want. And I don't have a good answer for this. I will say that for this graph specifically, this comes from the weighted data the way we produce the aggregate report is to weight the data such that small sample sizes are not dwarfed by larger sample sizes at the institutional level. So this would take out any sample size effect, or it should take out most of a sample size effect. And beyond that, we didn't do any predictive analytics on getting to the Net Promoter Score. As is kind of one of those criticisms of the Net Promoter Score, it's often hard to try and predict the rating on the 0 to 10 scale. I have done that in the past. It is not pretty, and it's very, very hard to do when you think about multi-sided data collection with changing experiences.
Right, I wasn't so much, just to clarify, when you say that you're controlling for sort of taking out the sample size, I think you're doing that when comparing one museum to another, or one museum to the rest of the museums. But this graph is showing within museum, I mean, just take the red line or take the purple line, one that really increased and one that really decreased over time. What I'm wondering about is it possible that both of those places have a small enough sample each year so that you could actually get large variation just because you're not getting a big enough sample size? And so it's not that the NPS, it's not that the true NPS changed, it's that the sampled NPS changed because of too small the sample size. And I'm just wondering about that.
Yeah, so great question. I totally misinterpreted what you were asking. And I actually have a note here that says example of sampling error for this presentation, which we didn't get into at all. So Josh's comment is essentially like, if you have a small sample size, let's just say 200, and through sampling error, or just actually random sampling in general, where instead of sampling that promoter, you sample a detractor, and you do that 3 or 4 times, your net score could shift 2-3 points, depending on how egregious that is. The short answer to your question, Josh, is no. And I can speak specifically about the red line. It is a large institution with well over 1,000 responses. The majority of these sites have done an excellent job with data collection, so that I don't have any quandaries about the sample size that are producing these NPSs. So I don't believe sampling has anything to do with the change in score. But because of that, it begs the question, what is causing the change in score? And again, this is what Justin is asking in the chat. How do or should institutions respond to significant changes in these scores over time? As a general comment, and I think some of you have been involved in these conversations, COVES is working on moving toward a more open source collaboration, in the sense that we're trying to be more open with our reporting. Instead of having a red line, we would be able to label it, or at least start a small group that is sharing data more freely, so that we can ask questions of those institutions. I think that context matters a lot when trying to figure out why Net Promoter Score or overall experience rating are changing significantly over time. And I don't have any good explanation at this point. I will say that if you're noticing significant drop-offs, as a couple of these lines indicate, that's something to pay attention to, because I know it's not random noise. But I don't know how to address it at this point. This is the first time we have done a year-over-year comparison for the full COVES cohort. We're planning on doing it again in FY20 to kind of see if these patterns bounce back. Like, do these lines stabilize and it's just a one-year blip, which would be weird, but could happen? And how do we address significant trends, like multi-year down or up, and how do we make sense of that? So just a note to all of you, it's these types of conversations are really important in getting to a deeper understanding, and sharing more data and being more open with it is one of the ways that I think we're planning on addressing it.
I will just throw out, related to Net Promoter Score specifically, I haven't done a systematic analysis of this, but just in some glancing across different Net Promoter Scores during reporting, a lot of times the proportion of detractors tends to be relatively steady, and sometimes the variation that you end up seeing is people shifting between promoter and passive. So, when you look at a Net Promoter Score that looks like it's crashing, 7 points or something like that, it's not necessarily that a whole bunch of people are giving you 0s and 1s or something. It could be that a lot of people who were giving 9s have shifted to giving 8s. So it's kind of worth always looking at kind of what the distribution is for that as well, because of the funny way that Net Promoter Score is calculated. There's lots of different ways to arrive at the same NPS, just for a little context.
Hi, can I just add a follow-up to your thing about making things transparent? I'm just kind of curious, just across the board, how open institutions are to sharing their data. I mean, obviously with board members, but with local communities and the public. I'm kind of on my own, and with some folks just pushing for, you know, we belong to County of Los Angeles, and this is their data, and these are the people we're serving. But I'm just curious. We never really had an official conversation in our institution. We write a report. How does everybody feel about just handing it out? So for another time, I'm just curious about the policies at other institutions.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment to maybe seed on the community of practice and get some like written feedback around who is sharing and with whom and how are the decisions made. But I do want to recognize that it's 2 minutes after 2 o'clock Eastern, so the end of our webinar hour. This obviously is a rich conversation that we could continue. Alex and I will coordinate with some other members of the COVES team and figure out how to keep this conversation going. For now, if you have questions, feel free to email Alex or myself, or post them to the community of practice for greater involvement. We will share some of the links that were included in the presentation and post the webinar to our YouTube site. So with that, thank you for joining us on Tuesday, and we will talk again soon.
Thanks so much.
Bye,
All right.
everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.